The emergency lights cast red shadows across the broken bridge as Kira pressed her hand against the cracked navigation console and tried one more time to restart the main systems, but nothing responded to her commands. Her ship, the Silver Wind, had been drifting through the void for almost 4 days now, and every hour brought them closer to complete systems failure and the cold death that waited in the darkness between stars. Beside her feet, the 2 dragons named Ash and Ember lay curled, together for warmth, because the environmental systems had failed completely in the aft sections, and even here on the bridge, the temperature was dropping steadily toward freezing. Kira looked down at her companions and felt a deep ache in her chest, because they trusted her completely, and she had led them into this disaster by taking a shortcut through an uncharted sector. The attack had come without warning when 3 raider ships dropped out of jump space and opened fire before she could even raise shields, and within minutes her weapons were offline and her engines were destroyed and her communication array was barely functional. She had managed to launch a single distress beacon before the power failed, but that had been 2 days. Tuggo and no one had responded, and Kira was beginning to accept that no one would. The Elven fleet rarely patrolled this far from the core worlds, and most commercial vessels avoided the outer rim entirely because of raiders and pirates and the general lawlessness that ruled here. Ash lifted his head and made a soft questioning sound, and his scales, which were normally bright silver, had dimmed to a dull gray that showed his distress. Kira knelt down and stroked his neck and whispered, "It will be okay, my friend, and we will find a way through this." But she was not sure she believed her own words anymore, because the oxygen recyclers would fail within the next 12 hours, and after that they would simply fall asleep and never wake up. Ember stirred and pressed against her leg, and the young dragon's body heat was one of the few warm things left on the ship. Kira had raised both dragons from eggs, and they had been her constant companions for the past 8 years, and the thought of them dying because of her mistakes was almost too much to bear. She pulled up the star charts on her personal datapad, because the main computer was completely dead, and studied their position, and they were at least 3 weeks from the nearest inhabited system, even if the engines were working. The raiders had chosen their ambush point well, because this sector was truly empty, with nothing but dead rocks and frozen gas giants for light years in any direction. Kira wondered briefly why the raiders had not finished them off or boarded to steal whatever cargo they could find. But then she remembered that her ship carried nothing of value except personal supplies and research equipment. Perhaps the raiders had simply grown bored with target practice and moved on to find more profitable prey. She walked to the view screen and looked out at the stars and tried to remember the last time she had felt truly hopeful about anything. Her people, the Silvari, were known throughout the galaxy as master navigators and scientists, but they were also proud and often arrogant, and they looked down on younger species as primitive and unworthy of serious attention. Kira had always been different from most of her people, because she believed that every species had something valuable to teach and every culture deserved respect, regardless of their technological level. That belief had made her something of an outcast among her own kind, and was part of the reason she had chosen a life of independent exploration rather than joining the Elven fleet or working in one of the great universities. The distress beacon continued its lonely broadcast, and Kira knew that even if someone detected it, they might not respond, because helping a stranded ship in the outer rim was dangerous and offered little reward. Most species followed the principle of calculated risk, and helping strangers in deep space was rarely worth the potential cost. She had heard stories about one species that supposedly helped anyone in distress regardless of profit or safety, but those were just stories and probably exaggerated by traders who liked to embellish their tales. Humans were the species in those stories, and they were relatively new to the galactic community, and most established civilizations still viewed them as reckless children playing with technology they barely understood. The Elven Diplomatic Corps had issued numerous reports warning about human unpredictability and their tendency to ignore established protocols, and their bizarre notion that personal honor somehow outweighed logical self-interest. Kira had never met a human herself, but she had read the reports with fascination, because they painted a picture of a species that was fundamentally different from everyone else in the galaxy. According to the reports, humans formed emotional attachments quickly and deeply, and they would risk their lives for complete strangers simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. Most species found this behavior baffling and potentially dangerous because emotions were meant to be controlled and managed, not allowed to dictate important decisions. But Kira had always wondered if perhaps the other species were wrong, and maybe there was strength in that kind of passionate commitment to ideals. The ship shuddered slightly as another non-critical system failed, and Kira checked her datapad and saw that the artificial gravity would be next to go. Once that failed, they would be floating freely through the ship, and that would make everything harder, especially keeping the dragons calm and comfortable. Ash sensed her worry and stood up slowly and stretched his wings, which scraped against the low ceiling of the bridge, and Ember copied his brother's movement. The dragons were only half-grown and would eventually reach the size of small spacecraft, but for now they were still young enough to fit comfortably in the ship's corridors. Kira had bonded with them using the ancient rites of her people, and that bond allowed them to sense her emotions and respond to her unspoken commands. She could feel their confusion and fear through the bond, and she tried to project calm confidence even though she felt neither of those things. The communications console suddenly beeped weakly, and Kira's heart jumped because that meant someone had detected the beacon. She rushed to the console and pulled up the sensor display and saw a single contact approaching at high speed from Galactic, north. The vessel was small, probably a corvette or light freighter, and it was moving faster than any civilian ship should be capable of traveling. Kira tried to hail the approaching ship, but the communication system was too damaged to transmit properly, and all she could do was watch and hope. The unknown vessel slowed as it approached and began a standard scanning pattern, and Kira realized they were assessing the damage before committing to a rescue. That was logical, and exactly what any sensible captain would do because boarding a damaged ship could be extremely dangerous. The vessel moved closer and positioned itself alongside the silver wind, and Kira could finally make out its markings through the cracked view screen. Her breath caught in her throat because the symbols were human and the ship's name was painted in both Galactic Standard and the strange blocky letters of human writing. The Wanderer was not a military vessel or even a proper merchant ship, but appeared to be some kind of independent salvage craft. Kira had heard that humans often operated in small independent groups, rather than following the organized fleet structures that other species preferred. The communication console crackled to life with a burst of static, and then a voice came through speaking in heavily accented Galactic Common. "This is Captain Claire of the human vessel Wanderer, and we have received your distress signal and are requesting permission to board and provide assistance." The voice was female and young, and carried an odd tone that Kira could not quite identify, but it was not threatening. Kira activated the failing communication system and managed to send a brief response granting permission to dock. Within moments she heard the docking clamps engage with a solid thunk that echoed through the dead ship, and then the airlock began its cycling sequence. Ash and Ember moved to flank her protectively because they sensed strangers approaching, and their loyalty made Kira's eyes burn with unshed tears. The inner airlock door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and 3 figures in environmental suits stepped through into the dim red light of the bridge. The lead figure removed their helmet and revealed a human woman with short dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She looked at Kira and then at the dragons, and her face split into a wide smile that seemed genuinely delighted rather than afraid. "Hello there," she said in that same accented voice, "and my name is Claire, and these are my crew Lucas and Nina, and we are here to help you." Kira felt something loosen in her chest at those simple words, and for the first time in 4 days she allowed herself to believe that maybe they would survive after all. Claire stepped fully onto the bridge of the silver wind and looked around at the damaged systems with an expression that Kira could not quite read, and it seemed to be a mixture of concern and professional assessment. The other 2 humans removed their helmets as well, and the one called Lucas was tall with red hair and freckles, while Nina had dark skin and carried what looked like a portable engineering toolkit. "I am Kira," said the elf woman, finding her voice, "and these are my companions, Ash and Ember, and as you can see, my ship has suffered catastrophic damage." Claire nodded and approached slowly with her hands visible and non-threatening, and she said, "We picked up your distress beacon 2 days ago, but we were in the middle of another rescue and came as soon as we could." 2 days was actually remarkable response time considering the distance and isolation of this sector, but Kira simply nodded her thanks. The human captain knelt down in front of the dragons and extended her hand, slowly, and said, "May I?" And they are absolutely beautiful. Most species reacted to dragons with fear, or at least caution, because the creatures were predators, with razor-sharp claws and teeth and scales that could deflect most small arms fire. But Claire showed no fear at all and instead looked genuinely fascinated, and Ash tilted his head and sniffed her hand carefully. After a moment, the dragon made a low rumbling sound that indicated acceptance, and allowed Claire to touch his neck scales Ember, watched this interaction and then pushed forward to demand equal attention, and Claire laughed and stroked both dragons with obvious delight. Kira felt her opinion of humans shifting because anyone who could win over her dragons so quickly could not be as primitive or dangerous as the report suggested. Lucas had moved to the engineering console and was running diagnostics with his portable equipment, and he whistled low and said, "Captain, you need to see this, and the damage is extensive." Nina joined him, and they spoke quietly in human language, which sounded harsh and quick compared to the flowing sounds of Elvish. Claire stood up and walked over to review their findings, and her expression grew serious, and she turned to Kira and said, "I am not going to lie to you, and your main power core is completely destroyed, and your life support has maybe 6 hours left." Kira had known it was bad, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it feel more real and more final. "Can you repair?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Lucas shook his head and said, "Not with what we have here, and even if we had a full shipyard, this would take weeks, and the hull integrity is compromised in 17 places." Nina added that the navigation computer was fried beyond recovery and said even if we got the engines working, you could not plot a course anywhere. Claire looked at Kira with those bright eyes and said, "We need to evacuate you and your dragons to the Wanderer, and we can tow your ship to the nearest port, but honestly there is not much chance of saving." Her Kira felt grief wash over her because the Silver Wind had been her home for almost a decade, and every corner held memories, and now she would have to abandon it like a piece of broken furniture. But she was also practical enough to know when a situation was hopeless and staying aboard would only result in 3 deaths instead of a damaged ship. She nodded slowly and said, "I understand and thank you for coming, and I will need to gather a few personal items. Take what you need," Claire said. "But we should move quickly because your oxygen levels are dropping faster than expected." Kira moved through the familiar corridors one last time with the dragons following close behind, and she collected her research journals and a few items that had belonged to her parents, and the small crystal that held images of her homeworld. The humans waited patiently by the airlock, and Lucas had rigged a portable life support unit to buy them extra time. When Kira returned, Claire said, "We should talk about your dragons, and our ship is not really designed for passengers of their size." Kira felt panic rising and said, "I cannot leave them, and they are bonded to me, and separating us could kill them." Claire held up her hands in a calming gesture and said, "I am not suggesting we leave them, and I am just saying we need to get creative with accommodations." Nina spoke up and said the main cargo bay is mostly empty, and we could convert it into temporary quarters, and it has independent life support. Lucas added that they could fabricate a heating platform because he had noticed the dragons seemed to prefer warmth. Kira felt tears threatening again because these humans were going out of their way to help not just her but her dragons as well, and that kind of consideration was rare even among her own people. The group made their way through the dying ship, and Kira could hear systems failing around them with groans and hisses and the occasional spark from overloaded circuits. The airlock led directly into the Wanderer, and the contrast was striking because while the human ship was clearly old and well used, everything was functional and properly maintained. The interior was cramped compared to elven designs and seemed to prioritize function over aesthetics, and there were exposed pipes and conduits running along the walls like mechanical veins. Claire led them through narrow corridors and said apologetically that, "Our ship is not fancy, but she has never let us down, and that counts for more than pretty paint." They reached the cargo bay, and Kira saw that it was indeed spacious enough for the dragons, and the humans had already begun setting up temporary partitions and heating elements. Lucas worked quickly with Nina to assemble what looked like a raised platform with integrated warming coils, and he said this should keep them comfortable. Ember immediately climbed onto the platform, and curled up with a satisfied rumble, and Ash joined his sister after sniffing around the bay to check for threats. Claire brought Kira a container that she said held food synthesized to match elven nutritional requirements based on standard galactic databases. Kira opened it and found a meal that looked reasonably close to what she would normally eat, and she realized she had not eaten anything in almost 2 days. The food tasted better than she expected, and Claire sat down nearby and said, "We keep a good database of different species requirements because you never know who you might need to help." Kira studied the human woman and asked, "Why do you do this and rescue strangers in the Outer Rim? And there is no profit in it." Claire considered the question and said, "Because someone has to. And the big government ships do not come out here and people deserve help regardless of where they are." "That seems dangerous," Kira said. "And you could be killed, helping the wrong person." Claire shrugged and said, "We could be killed, doing anything, and at least this way we are doing something that matters." Nina entered the bay carrying blankets and said, philosophizing again, "Claire, and save it for after we get clear of this sector." The human captain laughed and stood up and said, "Nina is right, and we should get moving, and those raiders might come back." Kira felt cold fear return and said, "The raiders who attacked me, and they could return." Claire nodded grimly and said, "We detected evidence of recent combat in this area and 3 ships operating together, and they like to patrol their territory." Lucas appeared in the doorway and said, "Captain, we have finished securing the Silver Wind for tow, and we should be ready to jump in 30 minutes. Claire turned to Kira and said, "You should rest, and we will take the first watch, and you are safe now." Kira wanted to protest that she should help, but exhaustion was catching up with her, and she had not slept properly in days. She lay down on one of the mats the humans had provided, and the dragons shifted to curl protectively around her. Through the bond she could feel their contentment and relief at being somewhere warm and safe, and their trust in these strange humans who had appeared out of nowhere. As Kira drifted toward sleep, she heard Claire giving quiet orders to her crew, and the captain's voice carried absolute confidence and determination. For the first time since the attack, Kira allowed herself to believe that maybe the stories about humans were true. Maybe. They really were the kind of species who would risk everything to help a stranger simply because it was right. And maybe she and her dragons had been incredibly lucky to be found by this particular crew. The ship hummed to life around her, and she felt the subtle shift as they prepared to jump to faster than light speeds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she was alive and safe, and that was enough. The last thing she heard, before sleep claimed her, was Ash purring softly and the sound of human voices laughing in the corridor outside. Kira woke to the sound of alarms blaring through the ship, and for a confused moment, she thought she was still on the Silver Wind and the raiders had returned. But then she remembered where she was, and sat up quickly, and the dragons lifted their heads in alert response to the sudden noise. The cargo bay door opened and Nina rushed in looking tense and said, "We have a situation, and Captain wants everyone on the bridge." Kira followed the human woman through the corridors with Ash and Ember, close behind and their claws clicking on the metal floor. The bridge of the Wanderer was small and crowded with all 3 humans working at different stations, and Claire stood at the center with her eyes fixed on the tactical display. Kira moved closer and saw 3 red icons on the screen approaching from their stern, and her blood went cold, because she recognized those signatures. "The raiders," she whispered, "and they found us." Claire glanced at her and nodded grimly and said, "They must have been monitoring for distress beacon responses, and they know someone came to help you." Lucas called out from the sensor station and said, "They are matching our speed and will be in weapons range in 8 minutes. Nina checked the weapon systems and said our shields are at full power, but we are outgunned 3-1 and we cannot take sustained fire from all of them. Kira felt guilt crushing her chest because these kind humans were going to die because they had chosen to help her, and it was her fault for broadcasting that beacon. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "and you should have left me." Claire turned and looked at her with an expression that was surprisingly calm, and she said, "We knew the risks when we came, and we do not abandon people, and that is not how humans operate. But you will die," Kira said, "and there is no way you can fight 3 raiders." Claire smiled that warm smile again and said, "You have never seen humans fight, have you? And we did not get this far by running away. She turned to her crew and started giving orders in rapid human language, and Kira could barely follow the quick words. Lucas redirected power from non-essential systems and boosted the shields while Nina armed every weapon the ship had. The Wanderer began accelerating and Claire took manual control of the helm, and Kira was shocked because no civilized species flew manually anymore. Computer systems were faster and more accurate than biological reflexes, and manual flight was considered primitive and dangerous. But Claire's hands moved across the controls with practiced confidence, and the ship responded instantly to her commands. The raiders opened fire, and bright energy bolts crossed the distance between the ships and slammed into the Wanderer's shields. The bridge lights flickered but held steady, and Nina returned fire with the forward weapons. One raider peeled off to flank them, and Claire saw it coming, and she threw the ship into a spinning dive that should have been impossible for a vessel this size. Kira grabbed a support rail to keep from falling, and the dragons braced themselves with their claws, and Ash made a sound that might have been excitement. The raiders adjusted their formation and tried to box the Wanderer in with coordinated fire. Lucas called out shield strength percentages and said, "We cannot take much more of this." Captain Claire did not respond with words, but instead executed a maneuver that brought them dangerously close to one of the raiders, and Nina fired at point-blank range. The raider's shields flickered and failed under the concentrated assault, and its hull began venting atmosphere. But the other two raiders were still fully operational, and they intensified their attack. Nina said, "We need to either run or do something crazy, and preferably before our shields collapse." Claire glanced at the tactical display and said, "I have an idea, but you are not going to like it." She adjusted their course and began accelerating directly toward the largest raider ship. And Lucas looked up in alarm and said, "Captain, that is suicide. Trust me," Claire said, and her voice carried absolute certainty. The Wanderer accelerated faster, and the distance to the raider ship shrank rapidly, and Kira realized what Claire intended to do. She was going to ram them. The raider captain must have realized the same thing because the enemy ship tried to veer away, but Claire anticipated the movement and adjusted course to match at the last possible second when collision seemed inevitable. Claire fired every weapon simultaneously and threw the ship into a vertical climb. The concentrated fire struck the raiders' shield emitters at close range, and the shields collapsed completely. Claire continued the climb and passed within meters of the raider's hull, and Nina fired the aft weapons as they passed. The raider's engine section exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up the bridge view screen. 2 raiders down and 1 to go, Claire said calmly, as if she had just completed a routine docking procedure. The remaining raider seemed to hesitate, and Kira could almost sense the captain's uncertainty. These were supposed to be easy prey, and instead, they had lost 2 ships in minutes. Claire opened a communication channel and said in her accented galactic common, "Leave now, and you might survive or stay and join your friends." The raider ship held its position for another moment, and then its engines flared and it jumped away into the darkness. The bridge was silent except for the beeping of systems and the sound of everyone breathing hard from adrenaline. Lucas started laughing and said, "That was absolutely insane. Claire and we could have died." Nina shook her head, but she was smiling and said, "We really need to stop picking fights with ships twice our size." Claire turned to Kira and said, "See, I told you not to worry." Kira realized she was shaking, but not from fear, and instead she felt exhilarated in a way she had never experienced before. "You are all completely mad," she said. But her voice held admiration rather than criticism. Claire grinned and said, "We prefer the term creatively brave." Ash and Ember had watched the entire engagement with bright, interested eyes, and now they moved forward to press against Claire's legs. The captain reached down to pet them and said, "Your dragons seem to appreciate good flying." Kira watched this interaction and understood something fundamental about humans that no report or study had captured. They did not calculate odds the way other species did because they added factors into their equations that seemed impossible to quantify: courage and loyalty and stubbornness and the sheer refusal to accept defeat. Other species would have run from those raiders because the logical choice was to preserve their own lives. But humans operated on a different logic entirely, and one that valued honor and protection of others above their own safety. It should have made them weak and vulnerable. but instead, it seemed to make them nearly unstoppable. Nina ran diagnostics on the shields and said we took some damage, but nothing critical, and we can still make the jump to the nearest station. Lucas checked their course and said we should leave this sector immediately, before anyone else shows up. Claire nodded and said, agreed, and let us get our passenger to safety. She looked at Kira and said we will take you to Port Haven, and it is a neutral station that accepts all species, and you can figure out your next steps. From there, Kira felt overwhelmed by everything that had happened and said, I do not know how to repay you, and you risked your lives for a complete stranger. Claire smiled and said, there is no debt between friends, and besides, your dragons are excellent. Company friends. Kira repeated the word carefully. And you consider me a friend already? Claire shrugged and said, why not, and we have been through combat together, and that makes us crew as far as I am concerned. Nina called out from her station and said entering jump coordinates now, and we will reach Port Haven in 6 hours. The ship hummed as the faster-than-light engines charged, and Kira felt the familiar sensation of reality bending around them as they jumped. She looked at the 3 humans and saw them joking with each other as if they had not just fought off 3 raiders. Lucas made some comment about Claire's flying, and Nina laughed, and Claire pretended to be offended. They were so casual about risking their lives and so comfortable with danger and uncertainty. Kira had spent her entire life among people who valued logic and calculation and careful planning. But watching these humans, she realized that perhaps there was another kind of wisdom. The wisdom of knowing that some things were worth the risk regardless of the odds. The wisdom of choosing compassion over caution and courage over calculation. She looked down at Ash and Ember and felt their contentment through the bond. The dragons had accepted these humans completely, and dragons were excellent judges of character. Perhaps Kira thought it was time for her people to stop looking down on humans as primitive and reckless. Perhaps it was time to recognize that humans possessed something that most species had lost. Somewhere along their path to civilization, the willingness to be heroes. The Wanderer emerged from faster-than-light travel near Port Haven, and Kira got her first look at the massive station through the view screen. The structure was built into a hollow asteroid and had been expanded over centuries by dozens of different species until it resembled a metal flower blooming in space docking ports of every size. And configuration jutted out from the main body, and ships of all types moved in careful patterns around the station like insects around a hive. Claire guided them toward a medium-sized berth, and the docking procedure was smooth despite the damage the Wanderer had sustained in the fight. Once they were secured and the airlock had cycled, Nina stood and stretched and said, I need real food and not synthesized rations, and who wants to join me? Lucas immediately agreed, and they both looked at Kira expectantly. Claire said you should go, and Port Haven has restaurants representing 200 species, and you can find proper elven cuisine, if you want. Kira hesitated, because she had been in space for so long that the thought of being around crowds of strangers felt overwhelming. But Ash and Ember both perked up at the mention of food, and she realized they probably needed fresh meat rather than the preserved supplies on the ship. All right, she said, but I should warn you that dragons can be intimidating to other species. Nina laughed and said, after watching them curl up like house cats, I think we can handle it. They made their way through the docking area and onto the main promenade of Port Haven. And Kira was immediately struck by the noise and activity. Hundreds of beings from dozens of species moved through the wide corridors, and the air smelled of different atmospheres and cooking food, and engine oil. Ash and Ember stayed close to Kira, and their eyes tracked every movement with predatory interest. Several nearby aliens noticed the dragons and gave them a wide berth, but Claire and her crew walked confidently through the crowd as if escorting dragons was completely normal. They found a restaurant that advertised multi-species cuisine, and the owner was a 4-armed being from a species Kira did not recognize. The owner looked at the dragons nervously and said, I am not sure we can accommodate such large companions. Claire smiled and said they are very well behaved, and we will pay extra for any damages if there are problems. The owner considered this and then nodded and led them to a private section separated from the main dining area by screens. The furniture was adjustable to accommodate different body types, and Kira found a comfortable seat while the dragons settled on the floor beside her. Nina ordered something called a triple-decker burger, while Lucas requested pasta with red sauce. Claire studied the menu carefully and then ordered items from several different species cuisines and said, "I like to try new things." Kira ordered a traditional elven meal and food for the dragons, and the owner promised it would arrive shortly. While they waited, Claire leaned back in her chair and said, "So what will you do now, and do you have family or a home to return to?" Kira shook her head and said, "I have been traveling alone for years, and I left my homeworld because I did not agree with my people's isolation policies." Lucas looked interested and said, "What do you mean by isolation?" Kira explained that the Sylvari believed they were superior to most other species, and they rarely interacted with the galactic community, except when necessary for trade. "My people think humans are reckless children," she said, "and they believe you will destroy yourselves within a few generations." Claire laughed and said, "We probably seem that way to species who have been spacefaring for thousands of years. But Nina said seriously that we have survived this long by adapting and helping each other, and that has to count for something." The food arrived, and Kira was pleasantly surprised that her meal was prepared correctly with proper seasoning and presentation. The dragons received large portions of raw meat, and they ate with enthusiastic messiness that made Lucas grin. "This is really good," Nina said around a mouthful of burger, "and I have missed proper food." Claire tried a bite of something purple and made an appreciative sound and said, "You should come with us." Kira looked up in surprise and said, "What do you mean?" Claire gestured with her fork and said, "You have no ship and no destination, and we could use someone with your knowledge of the outer rim." Plus, Nina added, "Your dragons are great for intimidating pirates." Kira felt something warm in her chest at the offer, but said, "I would only be a burden, and I have nothing to offer." Claire set down her utensils and looked directly at Kira and said, "You speak 12 languages, and you have advanced degrees in astrogation and xenobiology, and you have survived alone in space for years. That sounds like exactly the kind of person we need on our crew." Lucas nodded and said, "We are always short-handed, and having another qualified pilot would be incredibly helpful." Kira wanted to say yes immediately, but years of caution made her hesitate, and said, "Why would you want me and you barely know me?" Because Claire said simply, "We are good judges of character, and anyone who treats their dragons like family is someone we want on our side." Nina leaned forward and said, "Also, we saved your life and you saved ours by warning us about the raiders, and that makes us even. And now, we can choose to work together." Kira looked at each of them and saw genuine welcome in their expressions with no hidden agendas or calculations. Among her own people, every interaction was carefully measured and balanced, and trust was earned over decades, not hours. But humans seemed to operate on instinct and emotion and the willingness to take chances on people. "I would need to contribute," she said finally, "and I cannot simply be a passenger." Claire smiled and said, "We split all salvage and rescue fees equally among the crew, and you would be a full partner, not a passenger plus." Lucas added, "You can teach us about elven technology and maybe help us upgrade some of our systems." Ash nudged Kira's hand with his nose, and through the bond she felt his approval of these humans. The dragons had excellent instincts about people, and if they trusted Claire and her crew, then perhaps Kira should too. "All right," she said, "and I accept your offer. But I should warn you that I can be difficult to work with." Claire laughed and said, "We are all difficult, and that is why we work well together." They finished their meal and discussed practical matters like quarters and duty schedules and equipment needs. Nina suggested they could convert one of the empty storage bays into proper quarters for Kira and the dragons. Lucas offered to help Kira learn the Wanderer's systems and said the ship had some quirks that took time to understand. As they talked, Kira realized this was the first time in years she had felt like she belonged somewhere. Her travels had been lonely even with the dragons as companions, and she had missed having people to share experiences with. These humans, with their easy laughter and fierce loyalty, offered something she had not known. She was looking for a family of choice rather than blood. After the meal, they walked back through the station, and Claire stopped at an equipment supplier and purchased a new environmental suit sized for elven proportions. "This is for you," she said, "and every crew member needs proper safety." Kira took the suit and felt emotion tightening her throat and said, "Thank you." They returned to the Wanderer, and Nina showed Kira around the ship properly and explained the various systems and emergency procedures. Lucas gave her access codes for the navigation computer and said, "Feel free to update our star charts, and your knowledge of the outer rim is much better than ours." Claire found Kira later in the cargo bay where she was setting up a sleeping area for herself and the dragons. The captain sat down nearby and said, "I know this is all happening fast, and if you need time to think about it, we understand." Kira shook her head and said, "No, I have made my decision, and I want to be part of this crew." Claire nodded and said, "Good, because we leave tomorrow for the Tyrell sector and there are reports of a colony ship in distress." "Already?" Kira said with a smile. "And you do not rest, do you?" Claire grinned and said, "People need help, and we are here to provide it, and besides, life is boring without a little adventure." Kira watched the human woman and thought about how much her perspective had changed in just a few days. She had gone from viewing humans as primitive and reckless to seeing them as brave and compassionate. Perhaps her people were wrong about many things, and perhaps it was time for someone to bridge the gap between the Silvari and the rest of the galaxy. And perhaps Kira thought she could be that bridge. Starting here with this unlikely crew and their battered ship, and their unshakable belief in doing what was right, Ash and Ember settled down for sleep, and Claire stood to leave but paused at the door. "Welcome to the crew, Kira," she said, "and I think you are going to fit in perfectly." After the captain left, Kira lay down between her dragons and felt their warmth and contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she needed to be, with friends who valued courage over caution, and with a purpose that mattered. She closed her eyes and smiled, and for the first time in years she felt truly home. 3 weeks had passed since Kira joined the crew of the Wanderer, and she had learned more about humans in that time than all the diplomatic reports combined could have taught her. The work was constant because distress calls came from all corners of the outer rim, and Claire never turned anyone away regardless of the danger or difficulty. They had rescued a merchant crew from a failing life support system, and towed a research vessel away from a collapsing star, and even talked down a group of desperate pirates who were more hungry than dangerous. Kira discovered that she fit naturally into the crew dynamic because her technical knowledge complemented their practical skills, and the dragons had become unofficial mascots who helped calm frightened survivors. She sat on the bridge, now reviewing navigation charts while Claire piloted them toward their next destination, in the Tyrell sector. Lucas was in engineering, upgrading the shield generators with modifications that Kira had suggested based on elven designs. Nina monitored communications and occasionally made sarcastic comments about the quality of distress beacon protocols used by various species. Ash and Ember had claimed the observation deck as their territory and spent hours watching the stars with what seemed like endless fascination. The communication console beeped and Nina answered, and her expression grew serious as she listened. "Captain, we have a situation," she said, "and there is a colony ship reporting catastrophic systems failure, and they have 3,000 passengers, including children." Claire immediately altered course and said, "How far?" 2 hours at maximum speed," Nina replied. But there is a complication, and the ship is drifting toward a debris field and will enter it in approximately 4 hours. Kira pulled up the sensor data and studied the debris field, and it was dense with fragments from an ancient battle, and any ship that entered would be torn apart within minutes. "We need to get there fast," she said. "And can we push the engines harder?" Luca's voice came through the intercom and said, "I can give you another 15%, but we risk burning out the relays." "Do it," Claire said without hesitation. "And 3,000 lives are worth a few relays." The Wanderer accelerated, and Kira felt the increased vibration through the deck plates. She worked quickly to plot the optimal approach vector, while Nina coordinated with the colony ship captain. The colony vessel was called the New Dawn, and it was a massive civilian transport designed for long-range travel with families seeking new worlds. According to the reports, their main computer had suffered a cascade failure, and all primary systems were offline, including engines and navigation. They were drifting helplessly on momentum alone and headed straight for the debris field. Claire studied the tactical display and said, "We cannot tow them, and they are too massive, and we would never build enough speed to clear the field." Kira agreed and said, "We need to get their engines restarted, and that is the only option." Nina looked doubtful and said their engineering crew has been trying for 6 hours, and they cannot even access the main computer core. Then we go aboard and fix it ourselves, Claire said, and Kira, you are with me and Lucas, you have the bridge. Kira felt nervousness flutter in her stomach because boarding operations were always dangerous, but she nodded and said, I will prepare my equipment. She gathered her tools and met Claire at the airlock where Nina was already helping the captain into an environmental suit. Be careful, Nina said, and colony ships have crazy layouts, and it is easy to get lost. Claire checked her suit seals and said, we will follow the emergency markers, and besides, Kira has studied the schematics. They took a small shuttle across to the New Dawn, and Kira could see the massive ship more clearly now, and it was at least 50 times larger than the Wanderer. The hull showed signs of age and poor maintenance, and she wondered how such a critical vessel had been allowed to deteriorate. They docked at an emergency airlock and entered a corridor filled with frightened passengers. Families huddled together, and children cried, and the air smelled of fear and recycled atmosphere. A harried-looking official met them and said, thank goodness someone came, and our engineers cannot fix the computer, and we are all going to die. Claire put a hand on his shoulder and said, no one is going to die today, and just show us to the main computer core. The official led them through crowded corridors, and Kira saw the desperation in every face they passed. These were ordinary people seeking a better life, and they did not deserve to die because of equipment failure. The computer core was located deep in the ship, and they had to climb down several levels using emergency ladders because the elevators were offline. When they reached it, Kira saw immediately that the problem was worse than reported because the core itself had suffered physical damage from what looked like a power surge. This will take hours to repair, she said. And we do not have hours. Claire studied the damage and said, can we bypass the damaged sections and get minimal functionality? Kira considered the question and said possibly, but it would require direct interface with the core systems, and that means someone has to go inside. The core was surrounded by safety barriers and electromagnetic shielding, and accessing it directly was extremely dangerous. I will do it, Kira said, and I have more experience with these systems. Claire looked like she wanted to argue, but then nodded and said, I will monitor from out here, and Lucas can guide us through the repairs. Kira removed a panel and crawled into the narrow maintenance space around the core, and the air was hot and smelled of burning circuits. Her hands shook as she connected her portable computer to the main system and began running diagnostics. Lucas' voice came through her comm and said, I am seeing the damage now, and you need to reroute power through the secondary junction. Kira worked carefully because one wrong connection could overload the entire system and kill her instantly. Sweat ran down her face and her breathing sounded loud in her helmet. She bypassed 3 burned-out modules and jury-rigged connections that would horrify any proper engineer, but might just work. The core hummed to life, and displays flickered weakly, and she heard Claire cheer through the comm. We have partial function, Lucas said, and bringing the engines online. Now Kira crawled back out of the maintenance space and found Claire grinning at her. You did it, the captain said, and the engines are responding. They made their way back to the bridge of the colony ship, where the captain was coordinating with Lucas to restart critical systems. The engines fired, and the massive ship slowly began to change course away from the debris field. Kira watched the tactical display and calculated vectors and said, we are going to make it, but barely. The New Dawn cleared the debris field with less than a kilometer to spare, and the entire bridge crew erupted in cheers. Claire shook hands with the colony ship captain and said, you should head to the nearest station for proper repairs, and this fix will not hold forever. The captain thanked them profusely and offered payment, but Claire waved it off and said, just help someone else when you get the chance. They returned to the Wanderer and found the crew celebrating with music and improvised food. Nina hugged Kira and said, you were amazing, and Lucas said no one else could have fixed that core so quickly. Ash and Ember greeted Kira enthusiastically, and she felt their pride. Through the bond that night, the crew gathered in the common area, and Claire raised a cup and said to Kira, who proved today that humans are not the only ones crazy enough to risk everything for strangers. Kira felt tears in her eyes and said, I learned from the best. Lucas said seriously that we are changing the galaxy, one rescue at a time. Nina added that most species calculate risk versus reward, but we calculate right versus wrong, Kira understood now what made humans different and what made this crew special. They had chosen to be heroes not because they were rewarded or recognized, but because they could not imagine being anything else. And somehow she had become one of them. Over the following days, Kira sent a message to her homeworld, and she described her experiences with humans and urged her people to reconsider their prejudices. She did not know if anyone would listen, but she had to try. Claire found her in the observation deck watching the stars with the dragons, thinking about home. The captain asked. Kira shook her head and said, thinking about how home is not a place anymore, and it is the people you choose to be with. Claire sat down beside her and said, "That is very human of you." Kira smiled and said, "Perhaps humans and elves are not so different after all." They sat in comfortable silence and watched the stars pass by. The Wanderer received another distress call, and Claire stood and said, "Duty calls." Kira followed her to the bridge with Ash and Ember trailing behind Lucas, plotted a course while Nina prepped the medical bay. It was another rescue and another chance to help someone in need, and Kira would not have it any other way. She had found her purpose among the stars with a crew of unlikely heroes who proved every day that compassion and courage mattered more than technology or power. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, but it was also full of people willing to help each other, and that she thought made all the difference. The Wanderer jumped to faster-than-light speeds and carried them toward their next adventure. Kira looked around at her crewmates and her dragons and felt complete. She had learned that family was not defined by blood or species, but by shared values and mutual respect. She had learned that sometimes the greatest wisdom came from those who others called reckless. And most importantly, she had learned that being human was not about biology.